Daniel James, and welcome to the show. Well, my special guest this week has had an amazing year. He released a podcast that raced up the charts, and I'm delighted to welcome to the show this week, Mr. Tony Mantor.
Hey, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you, Tony. So, what a year it's been for you. We know you as a record producer, a songwriter, a musician with lots and lots of success behind you. But you decided to go a little left field with an autism podcast. Do you want to tell me how that all started?
Well, what's interesting is when I decided to do a podcast, most people just assumed that I would do something that was around music or entertainment. And there were so many of those out there. And I had worked on a project that supported our first responders. From that, I had a lady call me that had done some things within the autistic community, and she was a speech therapist. So she asked me if I could do something like that for them. And I told her I didn't think I was the right one because I didn't have anybody this autistic in my family. I didn't know anybody that's autistic. I just didn't think I was a good voice. As it turned out, it worked out perfectly because I interviewed these people. I asked them questions that I didn't know so I could learn. By that happening, it helped other people that were just finding out they might have an autistic child or just entering the autistic world that they didn't know anything about. So I was leading them down the path that I was going, giving them information, plus feeding my mind with information. And it's just turned out to be such a great thing because I've learned so much from all the people that's been on my podcast. And they tell me things that you would assume, and it's wrong to assume that. So it's just worked out really, really good. It's pretty amazing the perception that autism has because it's a wide spectrum. You've got some people that struggle every day, and then you've got other people that go out there and work every day and just fit into society, no problem whatsoever. And the unfortunate part is when people think of autism, they think of Rain Man, and it's so far from that. That's the Hollywood version. So when you get out there and you start really talking to people that are either autistic themselves or have autistic children or have someone in their family that's autistic, the stories they have to tell are so compelling in what they go through, how they found out, what they have to do, why they're different than other people, but yet they can get out there and be very, very productive. So the perception that society has of autistic people is mostly wrong because they just think that it's this, and ultimately it's so far from that.
I think there's an assumption when people hear the word autism that they just see, as you say, this one image, and they don't realize that there is a spectrum, there's a whole scale. And as you say, people can be functional.
Yeah. I mean, I've had so many stories told me about how they're so literal in the way they think. And like I had a lady from London that told a story, and that story has resonated with so many people, and so many people have used that in talking about autism in my podcast. And what it was is she woke up one morning, her mother opened the drapes and said, "What a great day for the human race." She took that literally as I have to race around all the time. So if she went down to the local store or whatever, she would try and beat her time all the time because she was racing. And it was such a literal story and such a pleasant story. But so many people, when they heard that, they connected with it. And that's one of my most popular episodes so far. And that was my first one.
Wow. It's strange. So you're learning as you go along yourself.
I am. I learn more every podcast that I have, every episode that I put out there, I learn something. And that's the goal of this whole podcast, is to put information out there that someone has gone through, and then hopefully someone else that's listening to it may be going through similar situations. They hear the person telling their stories and how they got through a certain situation, then hopefully that will lead them to helping them get through their situation. So that's the whole goal of this episodes that I put out, is to help people. And if I can just reach one person each episode, then it's a success.
Is that why you chose to go down the podcast route? Because it's got a wider audience now?
Well, I chose a podcast route because I had an opportunity earlier in 23 to co-host a podcast with some people, and it was a business podcast. So I did it, and then after I finished, it was this opportunity came along, and I kept pushing it and working it. I felt that this is what I need to do. I need to start my own podcast rather than be part of someone else's. So I started it. The first episode was the introductory episode, and it went out May 19th. The first real episode went out June 28th. And from that point, it grew in such a fast pace because I was only going to do 2 episodes per month. Within 5 weeks, I had so many people that had called me and reached out, wanted to be on the podcast, that I turned it into a weekly episodic podcast in August. And it's been weekly ever since.
That's incredible that the reach has become so big.
Yeah, I mean, and it's shown, I mean, I've had people on my podcast from South Africa, from the UK, from Europe, here in the US, Canada. I mean, and the interesting part is the charts, the Apple charts, it's shown up in so many various charts around the world. I mean, it's gone top 10 in some. Just recently, it was the number 2 podcast in England. So it's really done well for me, which I didn't expect. So I just keep putting it out there, and whatever happens, happens. If it's number 2 today and number 102 tomorrow, I don't worry about the numbers. I only worry about that if people are hearing it and it's helping someone.
What you've charted in the mental health charts, the health and fitness charts, it's almost as if you're breaking down barriers with this podcast.
Well, I hope so, because when you stop and think about it, the perception, as we were talking about earlier, of autistic people is not the right one. So if people that aren't autistic, but maybe know someone that's autistic, should happen to listen to the podcast, they will learn what some of these people go through. They will learn what the extremes of some people go through, and they will learn the not so extreme. Like, to give an example, I had one couple that had an autistic son, and when he had a major meltdown, it was like a tornado went through their house. I mean, it was just terrible. And they had to learn how to work with their child. They had to put out different things to calm him down. And it was a journey, and it still is for them, but they won that journey. And then I've got another person that I interviewed, and he's out there working, and he made a comment to me on the episode that if you walk into any pharmacy or any pharmaceutical company that does research or whatever, and you throw a stone and hit somebody, you probably hit somebody that's autistic. Because they focus and they drive themselves just like anyone else would, and they want to be successful. They want to have a life just like anyone else. So the only difference is they are autistic. So they have to take and approach things a little bit differently. Their brain thinks a little bit differently than ours does, but it doesn't mean that it's bad. So that's what people have to get over, this stigma that autism is a bad thing, because it's really not.
Well, that's the great thing about your podcast, the UK, India, Canada, South Africa. I mean, it's an international reach. Do you know, it would be a great idea to have them played in schools, because people might recognize some of those traits in classmates or college mates or even workmates, and then they'll maybe handle things a little differently.
Well, we do talk about the school system, and the school system needs help, funding, because when you have a child that's autistic and they don't know it, then it becomes a problem because they get bullied and because they think they're different, and they're really just autistic. They're just going through some functions that they have to deal with, and we're not autistic, so we won't understand that. But if we can put that out there on an episode where people can hear what they're going through, hear how they look at things, hear how they approach things, and then when they finally come with a solution to get them where they want to be, maybe then other people will just understand, and it might make the whole process just a little bit easier.
So tell me about some of the opportunities that have arisen through the podcasts.
Well, it's just kept growing. I've had people that's wanted to be on it. That I've had doctors that's come on and told their stories of how they approached it. I've had so many different walks of life come on my podcast, and because of that, I just have so many different things that pop up that just give me opportunities to do more with my podcast episodes, to bring out the things that we need to bring out so that people can understand. Because ultimately, this whole podcast is about understanding. Now, the autistic world has a slogan called Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month every April. I felt that's great. Autism awareness is great. Autism acceptance is great. But I also felt that you can be aware of something and you're fine with it. You're out there, go to work, do what you do. You're aware of something. You can accept it because you're aware of it. When you're aware of something, you kind of accept it. But just because you're aware of it and you accept it does not mean that you understand it. And because the understanding's not there, if you actually run into somebody and come in contact with someone that is autistic, that is having a meltdown, you don't know whether that's just being a kid that's just having a tantrum, or it's an autistic child having a meltdown. So if you can learn a little bit more by listening to the episodes, learn what they go through, learn what a meltdown is. So that way, if you run into somebody that's having one, you're not going to just take and scowl at the person and demean them. You're going to understand them a little bit better. And that just might make their life or their parents' life just a little bit easier so they can help control their child.
So it would be a great idea to have Autism Understanding Month as well.
My slogan is Autism Awareness, Acceptance, and Understanding. So I chose to make that my slogan because I felt that word was missing. So my podcast is about awareness and acceptance, but it's more about understanding because we talk about the things that need to be talked about. I've got an episode coming up in a couple of weeks that has a father and son, and the son actually very high functioning, and because they don't like to use that word high functioning, but they use that. So he classifies himself as a high functioning autistic person. High functioning basically is when a person that's autistic goes out into the world, communicates, interacts, where if you did not know that he was autistic, you would not know that he's autistic. But a lower functioning one, you can have someone that's 30, 35, and they've got the brain capacity of maybe a 12-year-old. So they have a harder time functioning within the world, interacting with people. They've got their issues that require them to do things a little bit differently. And because of that, it makes it a little harder for people that don't know someone that's autistic as to how to work and deal with that person, because you've got autism, and sometimes I found that someone might confuse autism with Down syndrome, because Down syndrome is a completely different thing, and autism is a completely different thing. Now, unfortunately, sometimes you have some people that are both, but the thing is it's completely different, and people need to know that it's completely different so that when they interact with someone that's autistic, they don't get into a situation of where they don't know what to say, or they don't know how to act, or they walk on eggshells because they don't want to insult anybody or demean anybody. But the more you know, the more you understand it, the easier it becomes for society to work within it and make it, something that people don't think much about because it's just part of the world.
And it's that getting that understanding out there that paves the way for more acceptance.
Absolutely. When someone this autistic is out there, they can talk, they can do speeches, they can do everything that a neurotypical person can do. I had one guy on my episode, and he told me that he does public speaking. And he said, you wouldn't believe this, but I had some people come up and actually ask me how I'm autistic and could have kids, because he was married and has kids. So they actually thought that because he was autistic that he couldn't have children.
Wow.
So that's the thing that we have to get out there and get people to understanding, because they're just like us. It's just their brain operates in a different way. And because of that, we have to take and get the understanding out there so that people can learn that it's not a bad thing. Because again, perception sometimes is reality, and it's not actually the reality that they think it is.
So you could be sitting on a bus, on a train, you could be working next to somebody, you could be studying next to somebody, you could be at a ball game next to somebody and interacting with them, and you would never know that they were autistic.
That's why it's such a wide spectrum, because you've got so many different areas that autism affects people. Let's make them violent. I mean, you've got some autistic people that are very violent, but you've also got a lot of autistic people that are very warm and caring and just generally good people. And even the ones that are violent are good people. It's just they're wired differently, and it makes it tougher for them to function, in our world. So it's just something that people have to learn.
Has there been any mention about diet involved in this? Would a person's diet perhaps affect or kick something off or accelerate something? Or
actually, it's interesting you brought that up, because next week I'm interviewing a nutritionalist about that. Because one of the things that autistic people have is a texture problem. They have problems with texture of clothing. They have problems with texture of food. So many different things of texture. And because of that, they won't wear it. They won't eat it. There's so many different things. So I'm having a nutritionalist come on so that we can talk about, what do you do when you have a autistic child that is texture sensitive with food, will not eat that, and how do you develop that? Because I was talking with one lady in, I think she was in Ireland, and she had to really work with her niece to get her to accept some foods. And now she eats anything, or not anything, but she's a lot better. So every person is different. The one thing that there's a saying in the autistic world: you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, because they're all different. And that's kind of the way we are. You meet me, you meet you, we're different. But that doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means we're different.
I'm just trying to imagine a young couple with a young child, and that child has those things you've just described, that they can't bear the texture of a certain food or a fabric when they're getting them dressed for school or for kindergarten, or they're trying to feed them. That must be baffling for them. If they don't know about these things that you're discussing, they must just be lost.
Yeah. And when a person first finds out that their child is autistic, there are so many things that are just so overwhelming for them. And part of the reason why I started this podcast is, when I decided that I was going to try and think about it, I started listening to other podcasts that delved into autism. And they were all talking about things that I did not understand. It was way over my head. And I'm going, I don't understand this. So if I didn't understand it, how could a person that's just having their first child that's autistic understand it? Because we're the same. I mean, we're both people that don't understand autism. The only difference is they now have a child that's going to have to live with autism for the rest of their lives.
The whole family have to be educated about it. And imagine if your sibling has autism and you don't know, how do you, there's a whole myriad of things for people to kind of learn to educate themselves about, to be able to live side by side,
Yeah, well, I've got that book right behind me. That's a lady that was on my podcast, and she grew up with 3 autistic brothers.
Wow.
So that book kind of describes what she went through and how she's addressed life and everything. Like, again, the reason why I started this podcast was, and the way that I did and the way I structured it, is because I didn't know anything about autism. A person that's just getting their first child that has autism doesn't know anything about autism. So I wanted this podcast to be one that people could follow and understand. So if you listen to my podcast episodes and you don't know anything about autism whatsoever, I guarantee you by the end of the 25th episode, you will have a better knowledge of an understanding of autism, because we get into everything that everybody goes through, and every family is different, and we cover a lot of things. It's just it's very, very informative.
Well, in a way, not only could you possibly recognize a workmate, a relative, grandma, I mean, the elder generation as well. We've talked about the younger generation. It's probably, very widely misdiagnosed in the elderly generation as well. So your podcasts are going to cover all bases. And that's what's fascinating about it, is it's almost as if you've opened up the learning about autism to a wider generation of people across the board, across the world.
I'm hoping so. Now, you brought up older generation. I had a lady on my podcast just here about a month ago. She said she lost 4 decades. She didn't find out she was autistic till she was about mid-40s. And then her 50s started, she understood it now. And she's a musician, singer, songwriter. And she's got a great show that she does. And she said that now her 50s are booming because she knows what's going on with her life. Whereas back in the 70s, when she was growing up, she had no idea what was going on, other than she knew she was different.
So, Tony, can you tell me how many episodes of your podcast are available?
I've got 23 that are actually episodes with people. The first one is the introductory. The last 2 are just, Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, that type of thing.
And where can people find these podcasts?
Well, they can go on any platform that they use, whether it be Apple, Spotify, Google, any of them. They can find it under Tony Mantor, Why Not Me, the World. Because they can go to my website, tonymantor.com, and I've got all the links there. So I'm pretty available. And if anybody has someone that's autistic in their family and they want to tell their story, I just urge them to reach out to me, because this isn't about having stars or well-known people on it. It's about having everyday normal people that go through things so that people can relate and understand what's going on.
I know this is a difficult question, but is there any one episode of your podcast that stands out, and why?
One that I think resonates with all people that are autistic, and the neurotypical world does not understand this, is Dr. Rachel Mosley. She's autistic herself. She's a doctor of research. And part of her research is on suicide. And this is something that people don't realize. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among autistic people in the world. So we talked about that during September, which is Suicide Prevention Month. And I think that's a very important episode that people need to listen to.
Thank you very much, Tony. Hopefully we'll talk again very soon. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you for joining me. Have a great week, and we'll see you again very soon.